Cool. Hello, everyone. First, I'd like to say that it's really cool to be here because tomorrow we're moving into this office, into TQ. So from tomorrow we'll be here. And this is my second week that I now live in Amsterdam. I moved here 1st of August, so I'm still looking for friends. So if anyone wants to become my friend, poke me after this talk, and I'll consider you a friend. Okay, so my name is Ives van Hoorne, which is a very hard name to pronounce, even in the Netherlands. So you can call me Yves, you can call me Ives, and my friends have more trouble with my name than anyone else. They call me Flip. If you want to call me Flip, that's fine as well. I respond to it. I am co-founder of something called CodeSandbox. Who of you have heard of CodeSandbox before? Woo! Really cool. Nice. Even though it's quite known, I'm going to show the homepage because that's what I'm most proud of. I've worked for 3 days on this animation, so I promised myself to show it every time. So, I was thinking for April 1st, I should make a soundboard or something in CodeSandbox that you can actually, have sounds when you click, my sounds. But this is CodeSandbox. It's kind of like your local editor. Oh no, an error. Gone. It's kind of like your local editor, but there's a preview here. So you can do typing, and it will update. And you can add npm dependencies, and you have multiple files. And the idea is that we want to kind of have the exact same feeling as your local code editor, so that you don't have to learn two environments. So that's in a nutshell what CodeSandbox is. This talk, I want to talk about the story of CodeSandbox, how it came to be, how it started, how it came here. And in between, I will give some small demos and some technical explanations, I'd say. And whenever I'm on minute 20, can someone put up their hand so I know when I'm on minute 20? We'll see. Okay, so let's start the story. 3 years back, I went to my first conference ever. It was called React Europe. And at the conference, I was new to everything. There were many talks, and the talks were mostly about what people built in the open source space. And I was super inspired by this whole ambience, like how people were building and showing everything. And I thought, I want to contribute to the open source space as well. So 3 years back, I decided to, get my hands dirty. And I started writing notes. Every time I had a problem, I would think of a solution and I would write it down on this list. And that was mostly it. I, of course, didn't do anything with the ideas. I first started going on vacation. I went on vacation to a village called St. Ives. And you can guess why we went there. And while I was on vacation, I worked at a company. We were converting Ruby on Rails pages to React. And when I was there, I got a lot of questions from my coworkers about React in combination with Redux. So they sent me code snippets on Slack. We didn't even have code syntax highlighting. It was very bad. And I had to parse their code through my own head because I didn't have my laptop with me and think what the problem might be. So that was one of the problems that I then had. And I wrote down that it would be super cool if people could put these code snippets from their local editor in a browser where they have a URL that they can share with others, and then others can view it as well. So the question was, what if I put my local editor on the web? And of course, I put it right here, there. And again, I didn't do much with the idea. I started studying, and I started drinking a lot of beer, going to a lot of parties. The co-founder of CodeSandbox is also here. And this is me. But after a while, when I was doing more partying than really learning, I started to feel a bit unproductive. If you look at my contribution graph, this is when I started studying, and this part is just empty. And I felt unproductive, and it didn't feel very nice, so I decided that during specifically my Java lectures, I started working on one of the ideas, which was the first one, a browser React editor that allows you to create components instantly. It was a very vague description, so I started with a very vague design. It's in Sketch. It's called React Sandbox. It's one of the best designs I've ever made. And it was very simple. You had CSS here, JavaScript here, and then you have these buttons on the left, which were supposed to be components. And this would have been the preview. I didn't do long with the design. I just started trying to implement it. And I remember being super happy with this already. It was code, a preview, and when you change the code, it would actually update the preview instantly. I was so happy with this that I started to add more and more to it. So the next version, you have already multiple tabs. And the interesting behavior here is that if you import from the tab, then it would take that code and use that code instead. And it was a very simple implementation, I'd say. There were two applications. You have the code editor, and you have the preview. The preview is a separate application that's rendered in an iframe. Then, whenever you change something in the code editor, it would use post message to send all the files to the preview, and it will transpile, which is making the code readable by the browser, and then evaluate the code. And the implementation, I rebuilt the implementation in CodeSandbox to keep the inception levels high. So this is it. It's a bit different design. I didn't use Sketch this time to map it all out. But how it works is, this is the source code, the top one. This is the transpiled code. And this is a file, and this is the other file. It's a React application. And what I want to mostly cover on how it works is, it's also using hooks. I am very modern. And what I want to cover is run code. So run code, this is everything that was done to make the code evaluate. What happens is, we have an object which is called files, and it has keys for the file names, and then code as a string. It takes the code, it transforms this code, so it transpiles the code using Babel transform, and then it starts evaluating the code with the evil eval. So everyone is telling me, don't use eval. Well, CodeSandbox is built upon eval. That's next level hacker man. I'm very proud of this. So it will run the code. And the interesting thing here are these variables. You have require, exports, and module. These variables, since this code is evaled in this context, are available in the code itself. So if you look at this transpiled code, this is what it evaluates. It does a require, which will mean that it will call this function. And this function recursively calls run code again, and then does the same flow again. So the cool thing is that this will already work. When you call run, it says hello. Well, this is not applicable. React, one-hand typing. And it will do this. And the reason that it works is because it does this require here, and that require runs the code again, and it returns the module that exports. And if you look at this transpiled code, it does exports to agree this function, and that's what's returned. So that was in a nutshell how CodeSandbox worked. I started to do more UI work after this. So the next thing that I had as the idea was that you could build projects on CodeSandbox and then import those projects in other projects on CodeSandbox. It was very cool because you would make these like mini NPM libraries that you can then reuse. So everyone could build their own library on CodeSandbox and then you could see them in your actual project. But it turns out that this looks very much like your file explorer. So I decided to just make it a file explorer instead. The funny thing is that you can see that I didn't start with the idea of an online code editor. I started with the idea of some crazy stuff. And this is starting to look a bit like CodeSandbox already. It even now has the name CodeSandbox instead of React Sandbox. Then 12 days later, some Dutchies will know this cat. It normally says, aandacht! And this is already looking a lot like CodeSandbox. We got support for NPM dependencies here, which is dynamically downloaded from Unpackage at the time. And you can kind of see that it didn't start with the React editor as idea. It started with the component editor. That was the initial idea. Then a component library builder where you can re-implement libraries in your own library. And then I wanted to make it online so you can publish your library and then other people can import it. And then it started to become very complicated, so I just said, okay, well, let's make it an online React editor. Around this time, Bas joined as well. Bas is somewhere here as well. He's co-founder. There he is. we do every project together. We've known each other since we were 12. So the idea is that I learned is that I should let the idea evolve. The final version of CodeSandbox was not thought of in the first version, so even if you have an idea, I would just start working on it and you'll figure out the details over time. Maybe you'll do an extremely big pivot of going from a component editor or component library builder to an online code editor. So 26th of January, it started to shape up. It was looking like a real editor. But then I lost motivation. Very, very useful. I saw CodeSandbox every day, and every day I started to get less impressed by it because I saw it every day, so it started to get very normal to me. So one of the things that I did then was I went back to the lectures because I stopped working on it, and my friends there, they asked me, hey, where have you been these past couple months? And that's when I showed them CodeSandbox, and they got much more enthusiastic about CodeSandbox than I was expecting. So that gave me a bit more motivation again. And you can see that I stopped working on it here. And I said to myself at that point, okay, we're going to work on CodeSandbox. We're going to try to finish every feature before the 1st of April. Every feature that's not finished by the 1st of April will be dropped. So naturally, you can see this huge spike of development. And a lot of features were actually dropped because on the 1st of April, not everything was finished. But we decided to release anyway. So there's the thing that I learned, that I should always seek for external feedback. In my case, I like seeing people use the product. I like people being enthusiastic, so that gives me motivation. I should also have tried to release faster. I was doing a lot of work on top, which in the end, some things were actually dropped from CodeSandbox, and it turns out that no one needed them, so I didn't re-implement them ever after. And follow KISS. Keep a simple approach. You can say, keep it simple, stupid, or you can say, keep it simple, stupid. And I like the latter version. For example, for the file system, I was thinking of like 5 different systems for the file system. Then I thought, oh, this is all over engineering. I should just put everything in a Postgres database. Now, 3 years later, we have more than 15 million files, and they're still all stored in a Postgres database. It sounds very scary. It works very well. So don't over-engineer. Keep a simple implementation. Over time, you can see based on the requirements what the actual implementation should be. Then I released it to, well, I had 60 followers at the time. So I created this tweet, and I got a whopping 6 likes, all from my high school friends. And they didn't even know they weren't even in coding. So it was that was a bummer. So I decided to post it on Reddit, and it got a lot more response there. And this is kind of when it kicked off. I started to do a lot of talking with people who were using it, and started writing Medium posts. And slowly over time, you could see people picking it up. That was super cool. This is one of my favorite things. Dan Abramov tweeted, when he still had this pink thing, he tweeted about how cool CodeSandbox was. I was so enthusiastic that I made a snap of it, like a Snapchat snap. You can see that because of this. This means this is so cool for the translation. And you can see that I sent this to all my high school friends again, and they didn't understand it. Then I also got feedback saying, marry me, I'm in love with you, this is delicious, thank you, I've included you in my will. I still need to find this person. Even at some point we were on Hacker Noon, and that made me super enthusiastic as well. So as you can imagine, I made this very scientific graph of how, as CodeSandbox got more popular, you could see that my past exams went down. I did pretty bad at my university, which others really didn't understand. I found it pretty hard to concentrate on learning math when I got like messages and people using CodeSandbox. So at some point I decided, what am I actually doing? And I decided to pause my studies. At that time, my excuse was to pause it. I'm still in a paused state of my studies, even though we have a company of 10 people. But I decided to pause it. And we started to write down some values because we're an open source project. We got a lot of feature requests, so we had to kind of categorize which feature requests, which features we wanted to implement as first thing. The first one is lower the learning curve. Second one is encourage sharing and discovery. And the third one is give a local editor experience trademark. And I want to explain the values and then give an explanation on how it kind of resolves in what's implemented in CodeSandbox. The first one is lower the learning curve. One of the things that I didn't really think of when releasing CodeSandbox is that people use it to learn web development on CodeSandbox. And that is super interesting. And it makes a lot of sense because people don't have to set up an environment before they can get started. They just have to go to a website, start editing the white text, and they've changed the web application. They can call themselves a developer, which is also my preferred way of learning. In the end, hopefully you don't spend most of your time in the build tools environment setting that up. And I think it makes sense to first actually taste how it is to build an application before you start learning how to, do the build tools. So that was really cool. One of the things that we do here that I find very nice is for some errors, because we have full control over the whole environment, we can detect everything. So for some of the things that we do, we change the errors to make them a bit more friendly. For example, if I would want to change this hello component to, I'll just change the import to hello. Normally you get this error, invalid character error, failed to execute create element on document, the tag name provided, blah, 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 blah. We have seen already that this file doesn't have an extension, so it's imported as a raw module. So we changed the error a bit, saying it seems like index.js is importing a raw module, hello, very Dutch. And we give a suggestion, rename hello to hello.js. And if you click it, it's renamed and it works. So that is one of the things that we do. We have this thing called error transformers where we use the environment, we catch an error and say like, oh, maybe we can actually provide something useful here. The second value is encourage sharing and discovery. So CodeSandbox was built for sharing, but it turns out that there is a gold mine of information on CodeSandbox. One of the things that we do is we have an embed, which allows CodeSandbox to be shared in articles, for example, on documentation. People can play with it and have some real feedback. But the thing that I find most interesting is our search page. So we have a search page which was broken at 5 p.m. today, and that's why I was very stressed. But we have a search page where you can see everything created on CodeSandbox. There are now 2.5 million sandboxes here. The cool thing is, if you want to learn like a library, you can get all the sandboxes of this library. For example, if you want to learn how Redux Thunk is implemented, you can filter on all the sandboxes that have been created with the Redux Thunk library. So you can use that as kind of like a reference point. And that's very interesting. There's a lot more that we want to do. One of the things is that we have an explore page where you can see cool creations. Like, I love this. And, this one is also cool. Ooh. Okay, next. The last one is local editor experience. There are two reasons that we want to have local editor experience. For the experienced developer, we don't want them to learn a new environment when they prototype something or want to share something on CodeSandbox. The second reason is that if a beginner starts to learn web development in CodeSandbox, if they at some point go local, we prefer that they also won't have to learn a new environment so that it all works the same. One of the things that we do is that this part is all VS Code. It's a literal implementation of, it's a literal port of VS Code. So what I want to do here, I want to quickly explain the story of how VS Code got implemented. It started with this announcement, themes. Sarah and I were attending a workshop of Sarah Drasner. She was using Night Owl as her editor theme, and we were thinking, wow, it would be super cool to also have VS Code themes in CodeSandbox. So we started to look at VS Code themes, and it turns out that the implementation of a VS Code theme is a JSON file, which makes everything a bit easier. Because the thing that we were able to do here, we use styled components. We just put the whole theme file on as a context prop for the styled components implementation, and we were able to refer to the theme and then with a small fallback. But this allowed us to put the JSON file on the context, and then you have multiple themes. Wait, maybe I can, well, I need 2 hands to do this. How do you, yeah, color theme. And you can use different themes. You have many. Whoa, I see everyone light up suddenly. But there was one problem and one challenge in this implementation. Who knows this icon? You do? Wow, that's very impressive. Okay, so this is a TextMate icon. TextMate was an incredibly popular editor for a very long time, especially in web development. And they introduced something called TM language. TM language is a specification of how code should be colored. So how code should be tokenized. So when you have a part of code saying it's like let A is 5, it would say let is a keyword, A variable name, 5 numeric. The challenge of this is, well, the cool thing here is that lots of editors after this also implemented this specification. So Atom uses this, VS Code uses this, but there is a challenge here because TM language uses reg expressions which can only be parsed by a library called Oniguruma. Oniguruma is a C library, and we've been trying to first port it to the browser a year ago by converting the C code to JavaScript. It turns out to be 30 times slower, so your parsing, well, your syntax highlighting would be super slow. But we now live in modern times, and we have WebAssembly, and it was super cool because Nick Sandu, he made something called Onigasm. Yeah. It's a WebAssembly implementation of the C library, and it's actually very fast. It's almost as close as the C implementation, and I think at some point we'll get to the same performance. This is, by the way, small off-road thing. WebAssembly is super cool. I recommend anyone to learn Rust. It's also very cool. So yeah, WebAssembly is a small future. It will help with web application development a lot. Then when we released it, everyone was enthusiastic, but there was one person who said, what about extensions? I mean, it makes sense, right? You have VS Code theme support, so extensions must be only one small step forward. No, that's not true. With context, it would have been crazy to support extensions, especially since we have. I was doing a Facebook internship at the time as well. So I was full-time doing an internship and then also this, but of course, must be fun to try, so challenge accepted. I'll give you a very small crash course of how VS Code extensions work. So you have VS Code itself with its UI, and extensions are executed in a separate node process, the extension host. This has a lot of advantages and makes VS Code very fast because the VS Code people, they don't control what extensions do, so making them run in a separate host allows them to still keep like snappy behavior in VS Code itself while still allowing extensions. The other thing that's really cool is that they can just restart the extension host at any time without restarting VS Code, and the only thing that you'll notice is that for some moments you won't have auto-completions or you won't have go-to-dev additions. And the extension host can also spawn processes like TS server. So this is how VS Code extensions work. Now, making it work with CodeSandbox was a bit more challenging because CodeSandbox was not running VS Code. So the idea that I initially had was to create a bridge between the CodeSandbox and the extension host. So we would run the extension host in the browser, in a web worker, and then we would convert all the calls, all the messages from the extension host in CodeSandbox to something that would work in CodeSandbox. It turns out that there was so much work, especially if you have 4 hours a day. Converting every API call to a compatible version in CodeSandbox was too much work. So the next crazy thing was to actually run VS Code in CodeSandbox so that we wouldn't have to convert all the API calls and make it work. So that was the first crazy idea to try. And the first implementation went horribly wrong. The idea was, so this is how VS Code as the application works. It's an Electron process. So you have the main process, and the main process can spawn render processes. And this is actually what draws the UI. And all of these processes, the main and the renderer processes, have access to the native modules, which talk to the operating system like FS, Net, TTY, module, HTTP, OS. My initial implementation was, let's stop all the modules. So try to make all the native modules work directly in the browser in CodeSandbox. Again, like the last implementation, this turned out to be too much work. Implementing file system in the browser, that's okay, but suddenly you talk about implementing Net and implementing TTY, and that was a lot of extra work. So the second implementation, I started to look into the code base of VS Code itself, and it's architected very C#-like. It's very interesting. You have a lot of different services in VS Code. And all of these services are responsible for their own part of the system. So you have the editor service, which is responsible for rendering the editor. You have the file service for talking to FS. You have request service for doing requests. And these services, they can require each other in their construct. So these are all classes, and they can be dynamically injected. So the editor service might need a file service to get the file. File service might need a notification service to say that the file was not saved correctly, and so on. So my next implementation was the idea of creating a CodeSandbox service, which would talk to CodeSandbox, and then re-implementing these services and overriding them with their own version. And these services, they would use CodeSandbox. So let's say we have the file service, it talks to CodeSandbox to get the files instead of FS. The requirements of this implementation were that we shouldn't change any existing code because we wanted to stay up to date with the VS Code code base. So we wanted to keep the merge conflicts down. So the goal was to not change any code of VS Code. That was pretty hard. So we do have a few minimal changes, but the advantage is now that when we merge with the VS Code code base, it takes like, well, I think 2 days or something to catch up to 2 months of development on VS Code. And VS Code has a lot of development, the amount of commits. Every time you go to the repository of VS Code, someone at least made 1 commit in the last half hour. It's crazy. The second requirement was to expose VS Code as an API, so that when you have outside contributors looking at the CodeSandbox code base, they wouldn't have to learn VS Code to add like a menu item to VS Code. So we exposed, for example, the ability to add menu items to VS Code by just calling some code in CodeSandbox itself. And it should be fast and small. Electron applications, they don't need to do a lot of tree shaking or code splitting. In our case, it was needed. So we wrote a tree shaking implementation. Well, I wrote a tree shaking implementation of VS Code to look at which modules were used and which modules were not used. There are a lot of tricky things here. For example, React is declarative. VS Code is incredibly imperative. We use Webpack. VS Code uses AMD loader, for some people who still remember AMD. But the advantages are also big. It's updatable, so every time that VS Code has an update, we can merge it, we can take a day, and we'll have the new VS Code in CodeSandbox. We're not reinventing the wheel. I even found some new features in VS Code while implementing it in CodeSandbox, which is really cool. And you can stay familiar with the existing editor. We do now also have extension support, so it's still, you cannot install your custom extensions yet, but that's one of the plans in the future. But it works very much like your own editor. And this is the final implementation. And one of the cool things I always like to show is that it's so real that, okay. I can even, so you have to configure, oh, this can close. And you can move. So I can even take my existing configuration from my code editor, and I can paste it here and save, and it will change my editor to be like, well, and it will fork the sandbox, of course, and it will change my editor to be like my implementation of the base editor. And it works with key bindings, it works with your settings, it works with a lot of, we use the Vim extension from VS Code to have Vim support, so you can do a lot of things that are implemented here. And if you want to talk more about how VS Code extensions are implemented in CodeSandbox, that's a whole other story, where we re-implement a small node runtime in a web worker. That's for at drinks, then I need a couple beers.
Yeah, that was crazy.
Yeah, that's a lot of work. And in the meantime, on the business side, we decided to grow the team. So we've raised an investment of 2.4 million from Kleiner Perkins and some really cool founders. For example, Koen from Framer, Dylan from Figma, the founders of Netlify, founder of Zeit, SourceGraph founder. So it's we have a lot of advisors, and we're now growing the team. So right now we're 9 people. The last 2 weeks we had a get-together of CodeSandbox. We're remote first, and from next month, so 1st of September, will be 10 people. And another thing that can be done in this scientific graph, that as more people start working on CodeSandbox, I start to work on code less. And I think this can be like a part 2 of this talk, about how suddenly you're shifting from doing a lot of coding to doing more writing documents instead in Notion. As though Bas is like the Notion master, so I'm still safe from that. But I still need to learn how to handle this, and that will be like for the next time, I think. So thanks a lot for listening. This is our cat, our student house cat, sitting on my keyboard, and now my keys are sticky. So it's a bad story, but it's a nice cat. Thanks a lot.